Hello, it's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Ronen Shay, and I am a gamer. Now, gamers tend to get a little bit of a bad reputation because of the violent content in games. There's a lot of research done about video game addiction and how that can potentially lead to depression. But the same thing can be said about social media and a lot of other forms of communication. So what I'd like to talk about today are some of the hidden benefits of video games. What I'm proposing is a balanced perspective. I'm not saying that we ignore the negative effects that video games can have. It's important to consider the violent content. It's important to also consider any potential addiction or leading to depression. But we do want to consider the positive benefits that exist also and realize that for every gamer, there's the potential of having a positive experience like improved team building, social communication, and just having fun with some friends. And so if we take a little bit of a look at this roadmap regarding how we're going to get to the idea that video games can help your persuasive communication, we have to start with the assumption that there are some positive benefits to playing video games. And if we can accept that assumption, the next logical question is, well, what are those positive benefits? And one of which we're going to talk about in detail today is persuasive communication, being able to give more convincing and more memorable business presentations. And the reason why, if you ask yourself how is that possible that video games actually allow you to do that, is because they're consumption experiences. The game designers don't just consider what you see and what you hear, they actually think about what you think and what you feel as you play the game. And as a business presenter, you can also give consideration to your audience's consumption experience. Experience-based marketers that do demonstrations at live events argue that people tend to remember 20% of what they read and hear, 40% of what they observe, and 90% of what they experience. And that's one of the key reasons that video games are very persuasive forms of communication, because you don't just hear and see Mario, you actually play through the adventure with him. You experience the adventure with Mario. Now, stepping out of the world of video games for a second to an example that most of us can relate to, if you think about going to a movie theater, we have the option to watch movies at home, on home theaters, and yet still, some of us choose to go to a movie theater, to experience a movie in a dark room, with a good screen, with surround sound, hopefully with a boatload of popcorn. And it's because it adds to the experience. It creates a positive feeling when you're out with friends at a movie that is more than just the message itself. And so if you think about business presentations in that way, if you can create a positive consumption experience where people are enjoying their time in the audience as opposed to just listening to what you have to say, then you're shifting from having people see and hear what you say to having people experience what you say. So remember that it's not just what you're saying, but it's how you say it that really affects whether your idea is going to move forward in a business setting. There are a lot of great business ideas that don't move forward because they're not communicated in a clear way. Now, while we can clearly now see that video games can provide really helpful examples of persuasive communication, there are other benefits. Studies have shown that video game players can experience improved decision-making skills, improved mental reasoning, as well as improved team building and giving and receiving feedback. To give a few examples of how this happens through the game design, Fallout 4 is a game that has multiple endings. You can only experience one of those endings through each playthrough, so when you make decisions as the avatar, those decisions actually do have an impact on the outcome, moving you towards one ending and away from another ending. Another example is the game Portal, which provides you with complicated puzzles that you have to do in order to escape from a sadistic robot that is running a factory. And then finally, Overwatch is a particularly interesting example that highlights the benefits of gaming because there is no single player campaign. To be clear, you cannot play Overwatch one player. Every experience is a multiplayer experience, and every time you play Overwatch, it's with other real-world people from around the globe where you're communicating with them, trying to accomplish a team-based goal. Now, many of the games that I just mentioned are sort of hardcore games. And if you're sitting in the audience, you might think to yourself, you know what? I've never played any of those games. Maybe I just play a little Angry Birds every now and then. Maybe I play a little Candy Crush every now and then, and that's the extent to my gaming. Well, that's okay. If you look at the bottom left quadrant of this chart, you'll notice that even with casual gaming, there are improvements to decision making that gamers can experience. So with platforming games where you run and jump like Mario, or puzzle games where you move blocks around like Tetris or Candy Crush, you are facing real decisions because you have a time limit. So you're forced to make that decision, otherwise you can't advance in the game. And then you do or do not advance to the next level of the game based on the decision that you make. This is pretty ironic because when you think about a business setting, sometimes we don't advance in our career because we're indecisive and we're afraid to make a decision. So it'd actually be helpful to maybe have that timer in real life where we do have to make the decision and kind of live with the effect. Now, the reasons why games are able to show improvements in decision making, in team building, in giving and receiving feedback is because of the game mechanics. And the game mechanics that the video game designer put into the game creates effective change in the audience. That's a mouthful. Game mechanics, if we break that definition down, are essentially the rules of the game. And the rules of most successful video games are that they allow the audience to explore the world and discover the message for themselves. They don't force the message upon the audience. Something else to consider is the effective change, that a lot of video games lead to a positive feeling in the audience, that you feel like you're having fun and you're enjoying yourself. Now, if you take game mechanics, the same components, the same variables that video game designers consider when creating a good video game, and apply them to your business presentations, you can actually turn your business presentations from something that your audience sees and hears into something that your audience experiences. So what I'd like to do now is look at some of the different components that video game designers consider when building a game. Most game designers will consider these 5 items, and they'll ask themselves different questions related to them. So we're going to take a deeper dive into these questions in a moment, but essentially all game designers consider aesthetics, usability, balance, meaningful choices, as well as motivation. So if we think about a video game and try and answer these questions in relation to making the next great Mario game, we can see how these game mechanics lead to a more interactive experience. And then if we take the same questions and apply them to a business presentation, we can see how the presentation evolves from just somebody speaking to something that the audience is experiencing. So over here we have Mario, pretty happy guy, and he's looking to make the next great Mario game. And so he has to ask himself a few different questions. The first question, is he giving consideration to a multitude of senses? Video games do an excellent job not just considering the visual elements of the game, but the soundtrack as well, and a lot of different senses that the audience is experiencing. Is the content accessible to both experts and beginners? Video games have multiple difficulty levels, easy, normal, hard, as well. In a game like Mario, the early levels are designed for beginners, whereas the more advanced levels come later in the game. Are there a variety of interesting ways to absorb the message? Well, traditionally in a video game we have a controller and we use that controller to control the avatar, but now we've introduced motion gaming, so there's a new way to control the avatar, and a lot of other franchises have virtual reality as well as augmented reality games. As a result of these new control schemes, you're no longer forcing the audience to absorb the message in the game, but you're having them explore the world freely and learn the message by exploring in the virtual world. And also, video games do an excellent job of highlighting how the audience will benefit. When you accomplish something in a video game, there's a digital award known as an achievement, where essentially you get some type of acknowledgement that you can put on your social media and show that you achieved this within the game. Let's take the same questions and apply it to a business presentation. Here's Ted, and he has to give a talk. See what I did there? And essentially, TED needs to consider a multitude of senses. So aside from speaking, does TED have multimedia, slides, video? Is the content that TED is speaking about in his business presentation useful for his boss, for people at his level, or for new people in the company? It should be useful to everyone in attendance, just not one of those three. Does TED provide a variety of interesting ways to absorb the message? So aside from speaking to the audience, is there an option for question and answers? Is there a way to solicit feedback? Is TED using handouts? Is TED, when he's explaining a new policy that the company has, is he saying what the policy is and expecting everybody in the meeting to then follow his instructions? Or is he providing the reasoning for the new business rule or policy so people in the audience, people in TED's company can understand why that new policy is coming into effect and choose to follow that policy in order to have a better work life? And then finally, is it clear to people in the audience the benefit of attending TED's presentation, how it improves their daily work life, and how it might help them eventually get to a promotion? Before I leave today, I just want to give you 3 items to remember. The first is the reason why video games are so persuasive and memorable is because they're consumption experiences. They're not just concerned about what the audience sees and hears, they want to think about what the audience is feeling as the message is being given. Remember that video games have positive effects on the players, like improvements in mental reasoning, team building, and giving and receiving feedback. And finally, as we just did in our example with Mario and TED, you can apply game mechanics. The same rules that make for a successful video game franchise can also make for a memorable business presentation. Thank you.